Settled. For centuries, the story seemed settled. Chagatai Khan, second son of Genghis Khan, ruler of a vast Central Asian empire, father of a lineage that shaped the destiny of millions. His story was written in battle records, carved into the geography of conquest, and preserved in the genealogies of dynasties from Persia to India. Historians knew who he was. They knew where he came from. The Mongol Empire was one of history's most documented catastrophes and one of its most studied conquests. There was no mystery, or so it seemed. Then scientists started asking a different kind of question. Not who was Chagatai Khan, according to the chronicles, but what does his genome say? What does the blood say, when stripped of its politics and its poetry? What does the ancient DNA actually preserve beneath the layers of empire, dynasty, and legend? What they found did not simply confirm the history, it complicated it. And in doing so, it quietly began to rewrite one of the most consequential chapters in the human story. This is not a story about one man. This is a story about what one lineage reveals about an entire civilization and what that civilization reveals about us. Better, the accepted history was always striking in its clarity. The Mongol Empire was born in the late 12th century on the eastern steppes of Central Asia in the region we now call Mongolia. Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan, unified scattered nomadic tribes through military brilliance, political cunning, and extraordinary violence. By the time he died in 1227, his armies had swept across China, Central Asia, Persia, and the edges of Eastern Europe. He was not merely a conqueror, he was, in the estimation of many historians, the single most influential individual in pre-modern geopolitical history. Chagatai was his second son. He inherited the middle portion of his father's empire, the vast Central Asian territories that stretched across what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and parts of Afghanistan and Western China. The Chagatai Khanate, as it came to be called, became one of the longest surviving fragments of the Mongol world order. Its language, a Turkic dialect now called Chagatai Turkic, became the literary tongue of Central Asian civilization for centuries. Timur the Great claimed descent from its legacy. The Mughal emperors of India traced their lineage back through Chagatai to Genghis Khan himself. The Mongols were Eastern Eurasian nomads. Their genetic homeland was the Mongolian steppe. The historical record was unambiguous, and for a long time, that was the whole story. But there was always something that did not quite fit. Archaeologists and population geneticists began noticing that long before large-scale ancient DNA studies were possible, that the peoples of Central Asia told a complicated genetic story. The populations that descended from or lived within the Chagatai Khanate, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Uyghurs, the Tajiks were not genetically uniform. They carried signals that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Eastern Eurasian ancestry, Western Eurasian ancestry, ancient Iranian ancestry, Bronze Age steppe ancestry. These populations were not simply the descendants of Mongol conquerors who had settled and mixed. The picture was far older and far more layered than that. And then there was the question of the Mongol genetic signature itself. Researchers expected to find a dominant Eastern Eurasian signal across the Chagatai heartland, a clear echo of the conquerors who had settled Tibet. What they found instead was far harder to interpret. The signal was present, but it was diluted, absorbed, mixed with something older, something that had been there long before the horsemen arrived. That was not evidence of conquest. That was evidence of a far deeper story. This is where genetics enters as a true investigative tool, not merely a confirmation device. Yes. Modern genomic research has given scientists three primary windows into human ancestry. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from the mother, traces the maternal line backward through time. The Y chromosome, passed only from father to son, traces the paternal line. And autosomal DNA, the vast majority of the genome, captures the blended picture of ancestry across all lines. Giving researchers a far more complex and complete view of a person's origins. For populations connected to the Chagatai lineage, scientists used all three methods. They compared ancient DNA extracted from burial sites across Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and the Tarim Basin. They analyzed modern populations who claim descent from Mongol administrative elites. They compared those functions against reference panels drawn from ancient Bronze Age steppe populations, ancient Iranian farmers, ancient Siberian hunter-gatherers, and East Asian populations going back thousands of years. What emerged was not a clean portrait. It was a palimpsest, a document written over again and again by different hands across different centuries. If you are the kind of person who finds this kind of buried history compelling, subscribe, because the human past holds more layers than any single textbook can contain. The conflict deepened as researchers began publishing comparative studies in the late 2010s and into the 2020s. The genetic evidence was not contradicting Mongol origins. Chagatai Khan's descendants did carry the expected Eastern Eurasian ancestry markers. The Y chromosome haplogroup associated with the so-called star cluster, the extraordinary patrilineal signal linked to Genghis Khan's lineage, appeared in populations across the former Chagatai territories, confirming the historical record in broad strokes. But the autosomal story was different, and it was more interesting. The populations that formed the human foundation of the Chagatai Khanate, the peoples who were ruled, absorbed, taxed, and sometimes massacred by the Mongol administrations, were not Eastern nomads. They were ancient Central Asians with deep roots in the Iranian plateau, in the Bronze Age steppe, and in even older layers of Eurasian prehistory. And when the Mongol administrators settled, when the conquerors became locals, when intermarriage happened across generations, the resulting genome was not Mongol plus Central Asian. It was something older and more complex, revealing itself through a new historical moment. The genome was not recording a conquest, it was recording a convergence. Researchers proposed several frameworks for understanding what the data was showing. The first framework was what some geneticists call elite male transmission. The Mongol ruling class was overwhelmingly male in its migration patterns. Warriors, administrators, and nobles moved into new territories and took wives from local populations. This produced descendants who carried the Mongol Y chromosome, the paternal signal, while their autosomal ancestry and their mitochondrial ancestry remained majority local. Under this model, the Mongol genetic legacy is primarily a paternal signal imposed on populations that were already ancient, already mixed, already carrying thousands of years of their own layered history. The conqueror's Y chromosome traveled, the rest of his genome did not dominate. The second framework is more unsettling for anyone who assumed that political conquest translates into genetic replacement. Researchers suggest that in several core regions of the Chagatai Khanate, the Mongol genetic contribution to the overall population may have been surprisingly limited, perhaps 10 to 20% of ancestry in some groups, even less in others. The administrative empire was real, the cultural legacy was real, the political transformation was profound, but genetically, the conquered populations absorbed and diluted the conquerors over time more than the conquerors replaced the conquered. The third framework involves what genomicists call a ghost population problem. When scientists model the ancestry of ancient Central Asian individuals from the Chagatai period, they sometimes find signals that do not match any well-documented reference population. There appears to be an ancestry component, possibly from earlier Bronze Age or even Neolithic populations, that has no clear living representative and no clean historical label. This ghost ancestry was already present in Central Asia before the Mongols arrived. It had been there for thousands of years, and it persisted through the conquest, through the Khanate, through the successor states, quietly preserved in the genome of people who never knew it was there. The landmark evidence came from a series of ancient DNA studies focusing on burial sites across the Mongolian steppe and the Tarim Basin in what is now Western China. Tarim Basin burials, in particular, generated significant scientific attention. These were individuals who had lived and died in Central Asia centuries before the Mongol conquests, and their genomes revealed a population of remarkable genetic isolation. They carried ancestry that appeared to descend from an ancient North Eurasian lineage, with limited mixing with either the Western Iranian farmers or the Eastern East Asian populations surrounding them. They were genetically distinct in a way that no historical record had predicted. When researchers then compared these ancient genomes to populations living in the same region during and after the Chagatai period, the picture became even more complex. The ancient signal did not vanish. It persisted, sometimes diluted, sometimes surprisingly intact, through layers of Bronze Age steppe migration, through the spread of Iranian-speaking peoples, through Turkic expansions, and finally through the Mongol administrative period itself. What this suggested cautiously, carefully, because the data requires careful interpretation, was that Central Asia is not a space that was simply overwritten by each successive wave of conquerors. It is a space where every wave left a partial trace, where no single migration fully erased what came before, where the human substrate proved remarkably resilient across millennia of political transformation. The story did not collapse, it deepened. The surprise, when it finally came into focus, was not what the Mongol DNA looked like. It was what it revealed about the populations it touched. Researchers expected to find that the genetic legacy of the Chagatai Khanate was primarily a story about Mongol ancestry spreading westward and southward. In fact, what they found instead pointed in a different direction entirely. The genetic legacy was primarily a story about ancient Central Asian populations, Bronze Age steppe peoples, ancient Iranian agriculturalists, even older North Eurasian hunter-gatherers, reasserting themselves through the demographic reality of intermarriage and population survival. Not the conquerors reshaping the conquered, quietly over generations, absorbing the conquerors, and beneath all of it, that older signal, the one that had no name, the one that predated every empire, every dynasty, every khanate, every legend of conquest. The genome of Central Asia was not simply a record of who had ruled, it was a record of who had always lived there, and they were older and more complex and more layered than any political map had ever shown. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the landscape, the high mountain passes of the Tian Shan range, where the wind carries the cold down from altitudes where nothing grows and nothing is forgotten. The wide, flat silence of the Kazakh steppe, where a single horseman becomes a dot against a horizon that seems to extend without limit. The river valleys of Fergana, where ancient cities grew because water made civilization possible. The desert edges of the Taklamakan, where the sand preserves everything: bones, cloth, secrets. These are the landscapes where this story happened, not in archives, not in palaces, in the long, anonymous life of ordinary people who planted crops and kept herds and buried their dead and carried, without knowing it, the most detailed record of human history that has ever existed, written in 4 chemical letters, copied faithfully across generations, waiting thousands of years for the technology to read it. That is what DNA is, at its most profound. Not a test, not a product, a memory. The only memory that does not depend on language or politics, or the willingness of the powerful to preserve the record. Why does this matter beyond Central Asia? Why does a study of ancient Chagatai genetics carry weight outside the boundaries of one empire and one historical moment? Because it reveals something fundamental about how human populations actually work, which is to say, not the way that political history suggests they work. Empires feel total, conquests feel absolute. The histories of powerful states and great leaders can make it seem as if the world was remade in the image of whoever won the last war. But the genome does not record victories, it records encounters. And what it preserves with extraordinary fidelity is the evidence that human populations do not replace each other. They layer, they blend, they carry forward traces of every group they have ever encountered, every migration that passed through their territory, every century of contact with people who spoke different languages and followed different skies. The Chagatai Khanate looked from the outside like a Mongol project, and it was in its political and administrative character. But genetically, it was something far more ancient. It was the latest chapter in a story that had been unfolding across Central Asia for at least 10,000 years, a story about populations moving, mixing, surviving, and leaving a record in the only medium that lasts every civilization. The human genome. The map is still being drawn. The studies published in the last decade have raised as many questions as they have answered. Researchers are still working to identify the ancient populations that contributed to modern Central Asian ancestry. The ghost ancestry, that older, unnamed signal, has not been fully explained. The relationship between paternal lineages associated with Genghis Khan's descendants and the broader autosomal ancestry of Chagatai populations remains an active area of research. Scientists remain cautious. The data points in compelling directions, but the field of ancient DNA is young. The sample sizes are still limited in some regions, and every new burial site has the potential to complicate the picture further. But that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The genome is not a textbook with a final edition. It is an archive that keeps revealing new rooms, and each room contains people, real people, who lived and loved and struggled and survived, whose existence was never recorded by any historian, but who are present still in the DNA of their descendants. Chagatai Khan's story did not end when the Khanate fell. It continued in the genomes of millions of people across Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. And the story those genomes tell is not simply the story of one conqueror's line spreading across a continent. It is the story of an ancient human landscape that absorbed that line, transformed it, and kept moving forward, carrying everything it had ever been, including things it had long since forgotten. The old map was too small. The genome drew a larger one, And somewhere in the mountains and the steppes and the river valleys of Central Asia, in populations that have never heard of ancient DNA studies or haplogroup frequencies or admixture modeling, the evidence continues to travel, written in a language older than any empire, preserved more faithfully than any chronicle, and only now beginning to be read. Stories. If stories like this move you, where science opens a door that history left closed, subscribe. There are many more doors, and the rooms behind them are far stranger and more beautiful than anything the old maps ever showed.